Gate 61, the gate of inner truth and mystery in the third line is called Interdependence. Over the time that we have been looking at these various lines together, we have seen that when we're taking a look at the third line and the process of trial and error that belongs to every third line, we also see in them that relationships with the other side always come as a bit of a surprise. The first to the third lines are convinced of their I know, because they are only within the gate process. But the reality is, as this line, Interdependence, says as its lifetime learning, that it is extremely difficult for truth to stand alone. This is lower trigram, of course, it's personal destiny. It's a process that is limited to the 61st gate, with no recognition that there's a rationalizing capacity of awareness at the other end in the 24. People who only have the 61st gate have an enormous amount of pressure in the head acoustically. All individuality is acoustic, but these are people who are always hearing sounds in their heads, buzzing sounds, ringing in their ears, their own voice, music. These are all typical individual traits, but particularly so with the 61 when it has no outlet. Because there's tremendous pressure here, there can even be a kind of density in the hearing that comes at times from that pressure, as if there's cotton wool inside the ears. And as a 61 in an open head, I can say this is absolutely my experience. When I have hearing aids because I am slightly on the deaf side, but when I don't have those, the cotton wool is just like, I take my hearing aids out, cotton wool goes straight in. And I've had tinnitus for years and years and years. And I often hear noises in my head. None of them tell me to do anything horrible, thankfully, but it's very much my experience that inside of my head is a fucking noisy place, unfortunately. And so one of the things I always thought is if I could get rid of the tinnitus, then maybe I could find stillness. I could find that silence within, and well, whoever knows. But yeah, it's something to consider. I think when we've got any of the when any of the head gates in an open head, there is this potential, but particularly in the acoustic 61. So the exaltation says the ability to establish relationships for the actualization of truths, and through their nurturing and protective power to ensure a stable environment in which they can continue to grow. The pressure to know enhanced through collaboration. Well, that sounds good, but this is an individual who's under pressure, has a lot of anxiety, is possibly melancholic, and it doesn't mean they're going to find a 24 who will rationalize successfully for it. What this is showing you is the dilemma or the mechanic that you see in all third lines. They are trying to learn through trial and error how to be social. This is the natural movement from the third line to the fourth line. These two lines, they sit at the midpoint together, and they're both basically unstable. The third line is unstable because it is in the personal process, and yet it is getting ready to step into the transpersonal. It's growing in that sense. It's getting to that point. So it's beginning to try to figure out who the other is, what the other is. And it's in resonance to the sixth line. So it is the basis of wisdom. You get to be a role model by first being the martyr in your own experiment. This is the frequency of bonds made and broken. You know that it will be very difficult for the individual knower to really have relationships that can actualize the truth. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. These third line inner truth people, they are constantly dealing with the wrong people. They constantly bang into people who can't help them actualize their knowing. Eventually, if they're fortunate, they can begin to recognize that there are certain people who can be beneficial for them, as well as the other people who cannot. This is an exceedingly difficult process because at some point or another, if somebody else doesn't get to know what you know, it's never going to mutate, and therefore it is useless. This is the whole thing about being an individual and dealing with mutation. Mutation is cruel. You know, if you don't know, if you can't explain what you do know, then you're really going to suffer, which means individuals, particularly at the mental level, if they don't complete the whole knowing circuit themselves, which nobody ever does, they have to find other individuals in their process who they can deal with. In the detriment, with an abundance of energy and in possession of a truth, the tendency to leave others behind or be crushed by their resistance, impatience with others, and the forsaking of relationships. For this third line in their trial and error, the most difficult thing in the world for them to do is rationalize somebody else's 61 to the satisfaction of that 61, because it's not going to be their knowing. This is one of the things about knowers. You can put anything in front of them, but until they can internalize that into their own knowing system, then they will give it no respect. So all this nice through collaboration thing, what you're really seeing is that's what they try to do to actualize their truth. It's a process. But this detriment is a classic. You know, a third line who breaks the bond, it's like, they can't make my knowing rational the way I want it to be made rational. And remember, you're always trying to be the other side. All of us, if we've only got one half of the channel, we want to be the other half. So everyone who has a question wants to bring their own answer. Everyone with a confusion wants to make sense out of it for themselves. And everyone who has an inner truth wants to make it rational for themselves. And it just doesn't work that way. So these third lines are impatient with others. If they do not get their knowing to mutate on to the next stage, well, it's really tricky, really tricky. And other people can be very upset by all of that. After all, here is someone inspiring for them. And yet that person simply turns around and walks away. As far as they're concerned, they haven't got what it takes. This is the process of the bonds and made and broken, trial and error. In the way in which we're structured genetically, the individual in the 23rd gate has to be able to explain their knowing. And that means that they must have the tools to be explaining their knowing to the other. So from the very beginning is this pressure that says the knowing isn't enough. If you can't get it into the consciousness of the other, if you can't mutate it. So from the very beginning, there's this pressure on the individual to learn how to socially adapt, which is very difficult. It can be hard for them to deal with people who are mentally collective. It can be done, of course, it can be done, but it is much more difficult for an individual to translate their knowing directly to the collective. And yet, in all individual gates, you will see this pressure on the individual to remember that they really aren't alone. Because if they really act like that, the other isn't going to pay any attention to them, and it's going to be hostile towards them. So, of course, the individual who doesn't want to be influenced and is designed not to be influenced by the other is still often under this pressure of being influenced by the other. And yet at the same time, you know, they still have to learn how to find a way to be with and mutate the other. That all adds up to a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety. The grounding is coming through gate 62 in the third line, which is called discovery. And this is a wonderful line to counter all of those accusations, third lines here, about them always making mistakes. As the exaltation here says, they have a genius for the unusual. When they are bumping into an inner knowing, they have the opportunity to discover whether or not it might be of value to anyone else, whether or not it might be mutative. It's hard for the truth to stand alone. And because the third line will always bump into others, it doesn't have to. The moon has been in gate 15 since 0122. This is the G center gate of modesty, of extremes. It moves into gate 52 at 1106. This is the root center gate of keeping still mountain, the gate of inaction. It's still the logical collective circuit. This is one of the gates in the format channel, bringing a sense of calm and focus concentration to the entire logic process. We have gate 39 next. The moon transits into this individual root gate at 2053. This is the gate of provocation. It points up towards the solar plexus into gate 55, the gate of abundance, the gate of spirit. Gate 39 is provoking to find a spirit that will match it. And finally, the moon moves into gate 53, the gate of development, the gate of beginnings, collective abstract circuitry now. It's actually another format gate for the entire abstract circuit this time, bringing the quality of cycles, the importance of entering into all experiences or anything else correctly. And it's another root gate, of course. So that is us for today in the third line, in the 61st gate. I'll be back tomorrow for a fourth line day. Until then, thank you as always for joining me. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Go gently.